The timber groaned under the pressure of the pry bar. It was old wood, softened by a decade of mountain rains and bleached by a decade of high-altitude sun. But the iron nails his father had driven were stubborn. Ilara shifted her weight, planting her boots in the damp earth, and threw her whole body into the effort. The wood splintered with a sound like tearing cartilage, and the first board pulled free from the mine's sealed entrance. A puff of cold, dead air, smelling of wet stone and something metallic, washed over her face. It was the mountain's first breath in 10 years. Beside her, Silas whined, a low thrum in his deep chest. The big Pyrenean mountain dog, his white coat the color of old snow, took a half-step back, his intelligent eyes fixed on the new darkness she had created. He looked at her, then at the black opening, a silent question in his gaze. Ilara reached down and ran a hand over his broad head, her fingers tracing the familiar line of his skull. "It's all right, boy," she murmured, her voice a low counterpoint to the wind sighing through the pines. "It's just a place." She dropped the splintered board to the ground and surveyed the rest of the barricade. Another 17 boards, crisscrossed and nailed deep into the heavy frame that plugged the tunnel mouth. Her father had sealed it himself, the day after the investors from the city had called his venture a catastrophic failure. A curse, they'd called it. A worthless hole that hummed and wept and refused to give up anything of value. Her father had simply nodded, his face impassive, and boarded it up. He never spoke of it again, but she would find him sometimes staring up at the scar on the mountainside, his eyes distant, as if listening to a conversation only he could hear. Now he was gone, buried in the small churchyard down in the valley, and the mine, along with 300 acres of rock and timber, was hers. The deed came with a letter from the town solicitor, containing a single, pitying sentence. "Your father's final debts have been settled, but I am afraid this property is considered to be of no marketable value." A fool's errand, girl. The voice came from the path below. Jedediah March, their nearest neighbor, stood leaning on a hickory walking stick, his face a roadmap of weathered skepticism. He'd farmed the adjacent plot for 50 years and had seen the mine's birth and its swift, unceremonious death. "Morning, Jedediah," Ilara said, not pausing in her work. She fitted the tip of the pry bar behind the next board. "Your father sank every last cent he had into that hole," he continued, his voice raspy. "Broke his back and his heart for nothing but a funny noise and a trickle of rust. What do you think you'll find in there that he didn't?" Ilara grunted as the second board resisted. "I'm not looking for what he was." "There's nothing else in there but rock and ruin," he scoffed. "That mountain is cursed. Best to leave it be before you follow him." He shook his head, a gesture of profound, unshakable certainty, and continued down the path, his mutterings swallowed by the wind. Ilara did not watch him go. She was already working on the third board. Her father had been looking for silver. The investors had pushed for it, their greed a palpable force even in their letters. But his journals told a different story. Late at night, in the quiet of the small cabin they had shared, she would spread the leather-bound books across the table, Silas resting his heavy head on her feet. The pages were filled not with assays and mineral reports, but with intricate diagrams of pressure gradients, thermal charts, and calculations that looked more like physics than geology. He had scrawled in the margins, his handwriting growing more frantic in the final entries. "They are deaf. They look for shiny pebbles while the mountain's heart beats beneath their feet. The warmth, the pressure. It is a living thing. It is the real treasure." The final board came away with a screech of tortured metal. Ilara stood back, her shoulders aching, her hands raw inside her leather gloves. The entrance to the adit number 1 was open, a perfect 5-foot by 7-foot rectangle of absolute black. The hum Jedediah had mentioned was stronger now, not just a sound, but a vibration she could feel in the soles of her boots. It was a low, resonant frequency, the source of the local legends about the mountain groaning. It wasn't a groan, it was a pulse. Silas moved closer, pressing his body against her leg, a solid, warm presence in the face of that cold, dark opening. Ilara took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, then stepped inside. The first 50 feet of the tunnel were a mess. A shallow pool of rust-red water covered the floor, and the timber supports her father had installed were slick with a pale, ghostly fungus. She moved carefully, her lantern casting dancing, distorted shadows on the rock walls. The air grew colder, heavier. The hum grew louder, a constant, encompassing drone that vibrated in her teeth. Her father's notes were precise. The primary water intrusion occurs at 61 feet, the cold spring. It must be diverted. The main shaft is stable beyond that point. The rock changes. She found the spot exactly where he'd said it would be. A fissure in the ceiling wept a steady stream of icy water, collecting in the pool at her feet. This was the first problem. For her plan to work, the main tunnel had to be dry. She spent the next 3 days hauling equipment from the shed. Lengths of metal gutter, braces, a bag of cement mix. She worked by lantern light, the outside world a distant rectangle of gray. Silas would not come past the entrance, but he sat there faithfully, a white sentinel at the edge of the darkness, waiting. On the 4th day, Mrs. Gable came up the path, carrying a covered pot. She was a kind woman, with a face full of worried lines. "Ilara, child," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the tunnel's mouth. "Jedediah said you were doing this. You can't live in a hole in the ground." "I'm not," Ilara said, emerging into the light, her face smudged with dirt and cement. "I'm fixing it." "But it's a mine, a failed mine," Mrs. Gable insisted, pushing the still warm pot into Ilara's hands. "It's filled with bad air and bad luck. Winter is coming. You should be in town, where it's safe." "This is my home," Ilara said quietly. "Thank you for the stew." Mrs. Gable looked from Ilara's determined face to the dark hole, and then to the patient dog sitting beside her. She sighed, a puff of white in the cooling air. "At least eat. A body needs fuel for whatever this is." Ilara ate the stew that night, reading the journals again. Her father had designed a simple but ingenious system, a diversion channel for the spring water, a secondary ventilation shaft to be bored through to the surface 200 feet up the slope, and then the core of it, the heat exchanger. The main tunnel descended 300 feet at a gentle grade, ending in a wide, stable cavern of granite. In the center of that cavern was a fissure, a deep geothermal vent that released a constant flow of superheated steam and water from the Earth's core. This was the mountain's heart. He had planned to run a closed loop of copper pipes down into that fissure, filled with water that would be superheated, then piped back up to the surface to radiate warmth. It was a furnace that would never need fuel, powered by the Earth itself. He'd never had the money or the time to build it. But Ilara had time. It was all she had. The next morning, she started digging the trench for the diversion pipe. The ground was rocky and unforgiving. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a shock up her arms. By noon, her hands were blistered. By sundown, the blisters had broken, the raw skin stinging in the cold air. She worked until she could no longer lift the tool, her body a single throbbing ache. She cleaned her hands in the cabin, bandaged them carefully, and fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The next day she woke before dawn, her muscles screaming in protest, and did it all again. Weeks turned into a month. The diversion channel was completed. The tunnel began to dry out, the standing water receding until only a damp patch on the stone floor remained. Her next task was timber. The supports in the first 100 feet needed to be replaced. She took her father's axe and saw and went into the woods that covered her land. She was a good woodsman. He had taught her well. She selected pine and fir, straight and strong, felling them with practiced efficiency. The sound of the axe echoed in the quiet valley. Limbing the trees, cutting them to length, and hauling them to the mine entrance was brutal, repetitive work. Silas often sat nearby, watching her, his head cocked as if judging the angle of each cut. Sometimes she would talk to him, her words small clouds in the air. "This one is for the 70-foot mark. The ceiling sags there." Or, "We need 3 more 8-footers to secure the main intersection." He would watch her, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against the pine needles on the ground. Mr. Thorne, who owned the lumber mill and the general store, saw her dragging a massive timber one afternoon as he rode his horse up the valley trail. He reined in, looking down at her with an expression of mingled pity and contempt. "Ilara," he said, his voice smooth and condescending, "I could have my men deliver cut lumber to you, for a fair price. This is no work for a young woman." "I have my own lumber," she said, not stopping, her boots digging in for purchase on the steep grade. "You're wasting your strength on a ghost," he said, gesturing toward the mine. "That hole is a blight. It's worthless. I'd be willing to take the land off your hands, give you a fair price for the acreage, enough to set you up in a small room in town for the winter." "It's not for sale." "Wait until winter," he said, a familiar refrain. "Wait until the snows come, and you're trapped up here with nothing but a cold rock for company. You'll change your mind." He clicked his tongue, and his horse moved on, leaving her alone with the weight of the wood and the echo of his certainty. She replaced the timbers one by one, a slow, painstaking process. She learned the feel of the rock, the way it settled and groaned. She learned the different pitches of the hum as she moved deeper, how it resonated in the narrow passages and flattened in the wider ones. The mine was no longer a dark, threatening place. It was a complex system, and she was beginning to understand its mechanics. She found her father's tool caches tucked into dry niches in the rock, his initials carved into the wooden handles. It felt less like trespassing and more like a continuation. Autumn deepened. The aspen groves on the far side of the valley turned a brilliant, fiery gold. The air grew sharp, carrying the promise of frost. Ilara made a list. She needed copper pipe, a great deal of it. And she needed fittings, valves, and a pressure gauge. This would take money, what little she had left from her father's small insurance policy. She walked into Thorne's general store the following week. The place was warm, smelling of coffee, leather, and wood smoke. A few of the town's men were gathered around the stove, and they fell silent when she entered. Mr. Thorne stood behind the counter, polishing a ledger. "I need to order 1,000 feet of 1-inch copper pipe," she said, her voice clear in the sudden quiet. Thorne stopped polishing. He looked at her as if she'd asked for a shipment of moon rocks. 1,000 feet? He repeated slowly. "And the associated fittings. I have a list." She placed the paper on the counter. It was a page from her father's journal, covered in his precise sketches and her own neat annotations. Thorne glanced at the list, then pushed it back toward her. "Ilara, this is an industrial order. It will cost a fortune. What in God's name do you need 1,000 feet of copper pipe for?" "A project," she said. One of the men by the stove laughed. "She's going to build a copper-plated palace in that cursed hole." Thorne held up a hand. "This would run you close to $700. You don't have that kind of money." It wasn't a question. "I have enough," she said. She had counted it out that morning. $717, her entire inheritance. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt. He found none. He sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of defeat. "Fine, it's your money to waste. It will take 2 weeks to get here on the freight wagon." "I'll be back in 2 weeks," she said. She turned and walked out, the silence of the men following her like a shroud. She spent those 2 weeks preparing. She cleared and leveled the ground inside the main cavern, 300 feet deep in the mountain. The air here was not cold, but strangely temperate. The hum was a physical presence, a deep thrum that seemed to originate from the very center of the earth. In the middle of the cavern floor was the fissure, a jagged crack in the granite about a foot wide and impossibly deep. A faint mist, smelling of sulfur and hot stone, rose from it. It was exactly as he had described it, the mountain's heart. She built the heavy timber framework that would hold the primary coil of pipe directly over the fissure, following the diagrams in the journal down to the inch. The work was slow, demanding precision. A single mistake could ruin the whole system. When the freight wagon arrived with her copper, Jedediah was there to see it. He watched as the driver unloaded bundle after bundle of gleaming, rosy pipe. "Good Lord, girl," he breathed, shaking his head. "There's enough pipe there to plumb the whole town." "That's the idea," Alara said, already shouldering the first heavy bundle. She began the long, arduous process of hauling the pipe into the mine. Each 20-foot section was heavy and awkward. She had to navigate the narrow tunnel, her muscles straining with every step. It took her 4 days just to get all of it down to the main cavern. Silas, as always, waited at the entrance, his form a familiar comfort every time she emerged, blinking into the daylight. Then came the assembly. Cutting, fitting, soldering. The journal was her Bible. Each joint had to be perfect, capable of withstanding immense heat and pressure. She worked with a small forge and soldering iron, the hiss of the flame and the pungent smell of flux filling the cavern. Days bled into one another. She lost track of time, marking its passage only by the number of joints she completed. Her world shrank to the circle of her lantern light, the gleam of copper, and the constant reassuring hum of the mountain. Slowly, painstakingly, the heat exchanger took shape. It was a beautiful, complex thing, a sculpture of geometry and purpose, 1,000 feet of copper coiled and looped into an intricate radiator that hung suspended in the timber frame over the fissure. From this central unit, 2 main pipes led back up the tunnel. One would carry cold water in, the other would carry superheated steam out. She finished the final joint in late October. The first snowflakes of the season were drifting down as she emerged from the mine that evening, her body humming with exhaustion and a deep, quiet satisfaction. The primary system was complete. The next phase was connecting it. She ran a smaller pipe from the diverted spring, the cold source, to the intake valve of the system. For the output, she ran the steam pipe not to her cabin, but to a large, open-sided shed she had built near the mine entrance. Inside the shed, she had constructed a secondary radiator, a simpler grid of copper pipes that would heat the open air. It was a crude, inefficient design, but it was all she had the materials for. It would be a test. She stood before the main valve, her hand on the cold iron wheel. This was the moment. 10 years of her father's theories and 4 months of her own back-breaking labor all came down to this. She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and turned the wheel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard it. a gurgle as the cold water began to flow down the intake pipe into the depths of the mountain. She waited, her heart pounding a rhythm against her ribs that was faster than the mountain's steady hum. 1 minute. 2. A low hissing sound started, barely audible at first, then growing in volume. It came from the output pipe. She walked cautiously toward the shed. The air around the secondary radiator began to shimmer. A wave of warmth, real and potent, washed over her. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a fire, but a deep, damp, life-giving warmth. Steam began to vent from a release valve, pluming in the frigid air. Silas, who had been watching from a distance, crept forward, his nose twitching. He approached the radiator, sniffed at the strange warmth, and then, with a contented sigh, lay down a few feet away, basking in the glow. Ilara sank to her knees, pressing a hand to the ground. The very earth here was growing warm. She looked at the steam rising against the backdrop of the falling snow, at her faithful companion resting in the impossible heat, and for the first time since her father's death, she smiled. It had worked. Jedediah saw the steam 2 days later. He came marching up the path, his face set in grim lines, expecting to find some kind of fire. He stopped dead when he reached the shed. The snow around it was completely melted in a 20-foot radius. Inside the circle of warmth, the ground was damp and green shoots of dormant grass were visible. "What in the devil?" he stammered, holding out a hand as if to touch the heat. He looked at Ilara, who was stacking firewood nearby. His ingrained skepticism fought with the undeniable evidence of his senses. "It's a trick." "It's not," she said. "It's coming from the mine," he said, his eyes wide. "The curse, it's heat?" "It's the mountain," Ilara replied simply. "It's always been there." He stayed for nearly an hour, walking the perimeter of the warm circle, shaking his head, muttering to himself. He did not apologize, not yet, but the mockery was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep and unsettling confusion. The world, as he had known it for 50 years, had just been turned on its head. The first blizzard hit in mid-November. It came on fast, a wall of white that erased the world. The wind howled, a physical force that rattled the windows of Ilara's cabin and piled snow in massive drifts. But inside the shed, the radiator hissed and steamed, keeping the space comfortably warm. Ilara and Silas took shelter there, the storm a distant fury beyond their circle of warmth. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the valley was buried. The snow was 6 feet deep on the level, with drifts up to 20. It was a once-in-a-generation storm, the kind old-timers would talk about for the rest of their lives. Ilara spent a day digging out her cabin and clearing a path to the mine. The town below was completely cut off. A week passed. The cold deepened. Temperatures at night dropped to 30 below zero, a deadly, penetrating cold that found its way through every chink and crack. Ilara had her system. She was warm. She worried about the town. The first visitors arrived at dusk on the 8th day. It was Mrs. Gable, her husband, and their 2 small children, all of them wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, their faces pinched and blue with cold. Mr. Gable was half carrying his wife. "Ilara," he gasped, his breath crystallizing instantly. "Our firewood, it's gone. We saw the steam. We didn't know where else to go." "Come in," Ilara said, leading them into the impossible warmth of the shed. The relief on their faces was absolute. The children, who had been whimpering with cold, stopped crying and huddled near the radiator, holding out their hands. Mrs. Gable looked at Ilara, her eyes filled with tears. "The curse," she whispered. "It's a blessing." "It's just heat," Ilara said, ladling out bowls of hot soup she had kept simmering on a small stove. They were the first, but not the last. The next day, Jedediah appeared, his pride finally shattered by the relentless cold. He didn't say a word. He just walked into the circle of warmth and began methodically chopping firewood from Alara's pile, his way of paying for his life. Later that day, 2 more families arrived, their stories the same. Wood piles exhausted, homes becoming iceboxes, the cold a lethal predator. The community of survivors grew in the shelter by the mine. They pooled their remaining food. The men organized work crews to clear paths and check on others. The women cared for the children. In the center of it all was Alara and her strange, humming machine. She was no longer the strange, solitary girl. She was the keeper of the flame. On the 10th day, a group of men from the Thorn lumber mill appeared, sent by their boss. Their bunkhouse furnace had failed. Mr. Thorn, they said, was holed up in his big house, burning his own furniture to stay alive. They looked at the steaming radiator, at the families huddled in the warmth, with disbelief. The crisis lasted for 2 weeks before a thaw allowed supply wagons to get through from the coast. In that time, nearly half the town, 37 people, had taken refuge in the shelter Alara had built. They had survived because of a dead man's mad theories and his daughter's stubborn faith. When it was over, when the town began to return to a semblance of normalcy, things were different. The way people looked at Alara had changed. The way they looked at the mountain had changed. Jedediah March was the first to speak to her directly. He found her checking the pressure gauge at the mine entrance. He stood for a long time, just watching her. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out rough, as if they pained him. "Your father, he wasn't a fool. He was just ahead of his time." He looked at her, his old, weathered eyes full of a new and profound respect. "What you did here, you saved us. All of us." "I had a plan," Alara said. It was what she always said. "Yes," Jedediah nodded slowly. "Yes, you did." A few days later, Mr. Thorn came. He looked diminished, his usual arrogance stripped away by the humbling power of the cold. He did not apologize. Men like Thorn did not apologize. Instead, he made an offer. "I want to invest," he said, his voice all business. "The town needs this. We could run pipes from here down to the main street. Heat the church, the school, my store." He looked at the mine. "Your father's folly could become this town's foundation. We'll call it the Thorn Geothermal Utility." Alara looked at him, then at the mine entrance, the gentle plume of steam rising like a steady breath. "It's not the Thorn Utility," she said quietly. "It's the mountains, and it's not for sale." "Then what do you want?" he asked, exasperated. "Help," she said. "I'll provide the knowledge. You provide the materials and the labor. We'll build it for everyone. No one owns the heat." Thorn was a businessman. He understood leverage. He also understood public opinion, and right now, the public saw Alara as a savior. He agreed. And so, the work began anew. But this time, Alara was not alone. Jedediah, with his practical farmer's knowledge, became her foreman. Thorn's mill workers, strong and skilled, provided the labor. The entire town contributed, digging trenches, hauling pipe, insulating lines. They followed her father's journals, which Alara translated from complex theory into practical instructions. The project became the town's project. They were healing themselves, not just from the storm, but from the years of skepticism and division. It took 2 years to complete the network. 2 years of shared work, of common purpose. By the time they were done, every home and building in the valley was connected to the mountain's heart. The winters were no longer a time of fear and hardship, but a time of peace and security. The town thrived. New families moved in, drawn by the promise of warmth and community. The story of the Great Blizzard and the girl who tapped the mountain became a local legend, told to children by the glow of radiators that never grew cold. Years passed. The copper pipes, exposed to the air, oxidized to a soft, sea-green patina. The town of Argent Falls, once named for a silver strike that never materialized, was now known simply as Hearthwood. Alara never married. She didn't need to. The town was her family. She became the quiet, steady center of the community she had saved, the keeper of the system, the woman who understood the mountain's language. Silas grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent his final years sleeping by the main radiator in Alara's cabin, his dreams filled with the phantom scent of pine and the memory of long, hard days of work. He died one spring morning, peacefully, his great head resting on Alara's lap. She buried him on the hill overlooking the mine entrance, beneath a tall pine tree where he had so often waited for her. She did not weep. Theirs was a bond that did not require tears for validation. It was a quiet companionship, and it had a quiet end. Alara herself grew old. Her hair turned the color of winter snow. Her hands, once calloused and strong, became gnarled with arthritis, but they still knew the feel of a valve wheel and the heft of a wrench. She taught the town's children about the system, passing on her father's knowledge, ensuring that the legacy would continue. She would take them to the mine entrance, now a tidy, well-maintained stone building, and let them feel the warmth radiating from the earth. "The mountain gives us a gift," she would tell them. "Our job is to be grateful and to take care of it." She died in her sleep on the first night of winter, 50 years after the Great Blizzard. The town was warm, safe, and dreaming. The entire community turned out for her funeral. They did not bury her in the churchyard down in the valley with the father she had so honored. Instead, they buried her on the hill beside Silas, where she could watch over the mine, her life's work. They carved a simple marker from a piece of granite taken from the mine itself. It didn't list the dates of her birth or death. It bore no religious scripture. It said only two things. At the top, her name, Alara, and beneath it, a simple statement of fact, the truest epitaph the town could offer. She warmed the valley. Long after she was gone, the mine continued its steady work. The plume of steam from the main vent rose into the crisp mountain air, a constant, quiet monument. It was not a monument to a single person, but to a simple, powerful idea, that the most valuable treasures are not the ones we take from the earth, but the ones it offers freely, if we are only wise enough to listen. The hum was still there, of course, deep in the rock, but no one called it a curse anymore. It was just the sound of home. It was the mountain's heart, beating steady and strong, forever.